I would like to welcome you all to this panel session. We are here to talk about where will fleets actually charge? Not might they charge, where will they actually charge? We're here to talk about practical realities, okay, and the depot versus hub context, and who's depot? What is a depot? What's a hub? Who's hub? But first of all, before we get into any of that, just please ask each of you in turn, starting with you, Cassia, to introduce yourselves, and then we'll pick up from there.
So my name's Kasia Chodorek. We've obviously all just met. I'm the Business Development Director at Aegis Energy. Aegis Energy is on a mission to accelerate the decarbonisation of commercial transport, primarily through the vector of infrastructure. So we're all about building public, clean energy infrastructure hubs for trucks and vans.
Fantastic. Neil.
Hello, my name is Neil Riddle. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Power. We enable payments and charging for electric fleets. I'm allergic to the word fleet. I find it a very hard word to use because ultimately it's a business with vehicles and they actually come in many shapes and sizes. And therefore we have built solutions that fit in many shapes and sizes. So public charging out on the road, so working with people like Aegis ultimately who build the infrastructure, but also supporting people who return to home and charge at home, although some of the larger vehicles won't be doing that, and therefore looking at things like shared depot solutions. And ultimately what we're helping people do is find, charge and pay for all their electric charging.
Super, thank you. And James?
Yeah, I'm James Brown from Energy Saving Trust. We are a mission-focused organisation, not for profit. All our profit goes back into our mission to address the climate emergency. I work as senior fleet consultant in the fleet support team, and for the last 20 years the fleet support team have helped fleets of all shapes and sizes to decarbonise, to sort of, we act as a catalyst really to help them to speed up that process by giving them the right questions to ask suppliers. We are independent, so we don't have anything else to sell, so we're able to give advice that's impartial, independent and pragmatic as well. So we've got a really good understanding of fleets. We nick the good ideas off the fleets that we see, and also help fleets not to repeat mistakes we've seen elsewhere. So we apply all the best practice, help from everything to do with how you operate and run your fleet efficiently, even back down to getting drivers to drive efficiently. But to at the other level, helping with decarbonisation advice, depot specification for charging strategies for home-based fleets. So if it's related to fleet and it's related to efficiency, then we do that.
Excellent. Okay, I mean that last point alone around drivers just reminds me of some stuff we hear about, and that the amount of difference that a driver's right foot can make to how effectively they drive a modern vehicle compared to diesel vehicles that they're perhaps used to. It's just another way. Beyond the many things that we want to talk about today around the physical, those behavioural aspects are really important. And I'm sure we'll pick up on some of them as we go. Let's just get out the idea of what is a depot, right? What do we visualise when we talk depot? And then equally, what do we visualise when we talk hub? Because I'm sure many people have many ideas. And so let's talk about what we mean so that anyone watching can then understand the context we have. Cassia, do you want to start? Don't mind which one.
Yeah, sure. I might start with the latter, hub. Largely because in advance of sort of doing a public announcement about Aegis, which only came up at the beginning of the year, there was a long and thrilling debate about the use of the word hub versus the use of any other word to describe essentially like a piece of public infrastructure or a public charging station, which is, I think, probably the language that most people will be familiar with because you have petrol stations in the kind of car market. So for every, like any sort of layman, that's the sort of association that you'd have. We opted for hub kind of as this idea of like this flurry of activity and this sort of flurry of decarbonisation activity, because for Aegis it's about sort of combining multiple different clean energy technologies or clean energy sort of refueling in one single location. But I think that in either case, what we're trying to describe are refueling, recharging opportunities that sit away from a fleet's home location, which is what I would think of as a depot.
And let's just pull out the public word there. So when you say public, what do you mean by public?
For us, public means if any fleet can access that infrastructure with or without pre-booking, but any fleet, any business which operates vehicles in a commercial sort of setting can rock up and use the refueling or recharging hub.
Great, thank you. I mean, it's one of the things I often wince when I hear the word public, but that's probably because of depot context. And when I talk to depot people about public, they throw their hands in the air. So,
and with risk of monopolising this particular bit of the conversation, I think that's actually a really big thing for us, that we always try and sort of tackle the word public like head on, because it has really negative associations, because I think of the car charging market, which you think of public infrastructure and you think of all of the poor delivery of standards and service and lack of SLAs and high costs and expense and queues and lack of operating kind of hardware. All of that stuff is essentially what we need to really, really sort of tackle head on and improve on immediately for commercially operated vehicles, where the standards just need to be entirely different.
Great point.
For me, depots are typically a location where a operator will store vehicles, maybe overnight, maybe it does vary, because obviously some organisations are all about fleet. Some organisations exist. The vehicles are the thing that makes the money, does the work. Other organisations may have arguably a depot, but for example, if you're a factory and your fleet exists to distribute the things that you make or the crops that you harvest, then you might still be able to describe that as a depot, as it's where your vehicles live. Depot doesn't necessarily have to be inside. It can be an outside parking area where vehicles are stored. It doesn't necessarily have to have much built infrastructure, but for me, it's largely, if something's depot based, it's owned by the company, and it's a place where the vehicles are based in the context of a vehicle depot.
Yeah. Neil?
I'm going to go back to the question on fleet before I go into the world of what a depot and a hub and a public and non-public looks like. For me, the word fleet is really hard, because you have organisations like maybe Enterprise Rent-A-Car, who have thousands of vehicles that they aggregate together, and they have a common ownership, and they are responsible for those vehicles, and they call it a fleet. But they're cars, often driven by members of the public, and therefore they're unlikely to be able to go to a commercial fleet charging location. But the owner considers them a fleet. You've then got fleets of much more van orientated. The classic example would be Royal Mail, red vans driving all over the place. They go back to the workplace, the depot every night, and they get charged there. And then you get return to home fleets who, vans again, delivering different places. And as you get bigger and bigger, you get certain physical restrictions on those vehicles. And I think that's where we start to get an interesting conversation emerging between the definition of a public charging location, a hub that is available for commercial vehicles, and a true workplace or depot that is restricted to a certain vehicle type. So very boring. There's a bit of physics in here. Big commercial vehicles are big. They're long by nature, they're high by nature, they're broad by nature, and as a consequence, they have certain physical constraints. So one of the things that we've been observing as we've moved on this transition from sort of the charging of electric cars and electric vans is that physical size changes. So a parking bay, believe it or not, has a standard size. So a standard parking bay has a set of dimensions. Now, sadly, cars have got a lot bigger, so many cars now struggle to fit into those bays. You get some charge point operators who come along and slap a charger into the bay, and therefore the parking bay now gets further reduced. And quite often that happens in a workplace where you physically don't have the space. There's a wall, you stick a charger on, it kind of reduces the bay. So as a consequence, there's a physical dimension to consider. And I think what's really interesting with the emergence of true commercial vehicle charging solutions is the recognition that you have to almost like wipe all the lines off the piece of tarmac and start again with your physical layout. And the designs I've seen for what you guys are developing and some of the work that's gone into things like the Mylent site for larger vehicles is it's about drive-through, it's about configuring the charger and the physical space to enable those electric vehicles access to it. So it kind of leads me to a different set of definitions. So we conventionally think about people who charge at home, which applies to vans, perhaps less so the larger vehicles. We think about people who charge on the road, and then we think about people who charge in the workplace. And that workplace might be my workplace or it might be your workplace, in which case you're sharing a workplace. Yeah. But when you're on the road, your choices change. And if you're driving a particularly large vehicle, all the rigid trucks that are out there now, all the EHGVs that are coming, you suddenly have to look for that physical space. And that's when you have to look at the question that we've been struggling with so much, which is how do you classify electric charging locations?
Yeah.
And we've ended up with something really crude, which is small, medium, and large. Small is a standard bay. It's a car or a van that fits in a standard bay. Medium is everything between small and large is an EHGV. And medium, therefore, encompasses this huge gamut of, it doesn't fit in a standard bay, it's a long wheelbase vehicle, it's a towing vehicle, or it's a rigid truck, and that sits in that medium category. And therefore, when I think about depots, one of the first things I'm going to think about is, what else do you have at that depot? Is it your farm vehicles that go in there and therefore you need the space, or is it literally just a bunch of vans that go into really standard bays? And therefore, depot in its own right is not that useful to me. I need to understand how it's being used, and then we can start looking at the basic physics of how big is the space you have available and what is it intended to do.
Great. It's a really fascinating points on a number of fronts for me, because mixed fleet applications bring with them a whole host of considerations for anyone deploying that power infrastructure. So I'd like you to think about that, and we'll come on to that as a specific question. And it's very interesting. You talked about rent a car, car rental solutions. For me, they are commercial operations. I don't think of them as commercial vehicles.
Agreed.
And that's, again, that's why it's important that we set these terms out, so that when people are considering what we're talking about, they understand our context.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's really good. That point then, James, around the shape, size, nature of fitting in charging infrastructure in what's there versus etch a sketch, wipe it clean and then relay out. What's your experience from the years of work you've done as to how people consider that?
Yeah. Okay. So it will vary, obviously, with the size of the vehicles. I think there's a lot of differing operating models. So in the public sector, you will have let's say a waste fleet. So you might have 30 or 40 bin trucks based out of a location. And that's quite simple because they single shift in general. They will come back and be parked up overnight, so they can be charged nice and slow, AC charged maybe at 22 kilowatts, and that can probably be fairly simple in terms of how it lays out. There are complications. You don't want sort of opportunity to crash into charging infrastructure. We've seen some real progress with First Bus and the roof-mounted charging solutions there, and that really adds to perhaps the fleets where there is a bit more of a through flow. And obviously, there's lots of considerations, how much power you need if you're double shifting your vehicles, and they do come back to change of shift. Having high powered chargers to top those vehicles up is essential. And there is thought that needs to go into how those vehicles go in and out, especially if there's a lot of movement. So I think movement is a key a key factor in how things are planned. If there is just one movement a day in and one movement a day out, then it's less critical. Although then there is opportunity, if those vehicles are out all day, to invite in other movement, which I'm sure we will get onto. But yeah, that would be how I would work at it. Obviously, looking at smaller vehicles, car parks and vans, it is a lot more simple when vehicles are depot based, but realistically these vehicles tend to be more dispersed in general, though obviously within the public sector you do still get quite a lot of depot based vans as well.
I mean, one of the interesting things, in fact it was Lorna McAteer spoke to me about, was thinking about the van as a workspace. Yeah. And where the charge point is and how it might impede the van as a workspace. So on site, able to charge, but actually constrained by the fact that you're stepping over, stepping round, can't open the door.
You can't open the sliding door.
Indeed. Yeah. So there are many interesting dimensions in why someone might design their infrastructure to suit their need. Cassie, you as a hub provider with multiple users coming to the site with various size vehicles, how are you sort of approaching solving those problems rather than having a solution that you hope works for everyone?
Yeah, so it's exactly as Neil had sort of described it in terms of that wiping the slate or wiping the whiteboard clean of the original footprint for sort of car parking, car charging layouts. All Aegis Energy Hubs have been from scratch designed for the specifications, the dimensions of vans in the van zone and the largest HGVs within the truck zone. And it's, there's a comical and sort of great reel that you can produce of all of the ways that vans have been forced onto car bays, and they're sort of overhanging and they're sort of diagonally across, and we've seen the stuff that GridServe put out about trucks just straddling sort of 4 bays. It's obviously out there, and that's happening because there isn't, to my knowledge, a great deal, if any, sort of dedicated van charging out there in terms of the hubs. I think there's a couple of companies looking at it or launching soon, and as we know, it's very, very sparse for HGVs. So it's about, from the outset, creating at the minimum the right dimensions, the sort of optimized layout so that you're kind of configuring it for the biggest vans, the biggest trucks. Yeah. It's about testing it in real life. We've recently done some site layout testing with friends in this room at the Silverstone track. That taught us that we were overestimating how many vans we were going to be able to fit in the van bays. It's led us to go straight back to architectural designs, reconfigure it, resketch it before we go into construction. It's an essential sort of step that anyone who's embarking on this journey obviously needs to be taking to make sure that you're not going to end up embarrassing yourself later down the line by underestimating how much space these vehicles require.
Yeah, I think I remember GridServe doing something similar on an airfield somewhere and seeing lots of cones marked out and different angled bays and all that fun that Sam Clark and his colleagues often talk about. And it's interesting, I think, in terms of when I go back to large car hubs that I was involved in at SSE, we always talked about thinking about development over time and not creating a lot of hard landscaping that if you needed to reconfigure was a whole lot more civils and rework. Is there some future-proofing context within what you're doing?
Yeah, totally. We use modular as one of our sort of paramount tenets of design and construction, and that usually speaks to sort of modularity and how we can build out the sites to begin with. So our hubs are going to be anywhere between sort of 3-8 acres, which can be up to 4.5 football pitches, but a lot of them will be a lot smaller. The idea being that obviously we wouldn't install all of the hardware or the kit on day one. You sort of spec it for where the market maturity is, and then you allow, hopefully, adoption to accelerate and to take off. And then you kind of, obviously install subsequent chargers as you need them as the market picks up.
Yeah, but with passive infrastructure, essentially. So the readiness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Readiness to install, readiness to ramp up.
And then Neil, where do you see this from a point of view of coming at it with the power lenses on, the power glasses on? What are you seeing and how are you considering these things when you're talking to operators about their sites?
So one of the things that I'd observe is that we're on a transition. We're moving from nothing to something. We are now at a point where we've learned quite a bit. I think the mere fact that we use the language hubs to describe what you guys are building at Aegis is ridiculous, because 4 or 5 years ago a hub was 3 chargers or more. And see what I mean? It's like you suddenly go, well, a hub now is like 10, 15, 20 chargers and facilities and amenities and security cameras and all sorts of other things. And I remember when ZapMap introduced their hubs filter, there was a long debate over whether it should be 3 or 4 chargers in a location. And because of the fact that we're on a transition, our language is dynamic, and the way that we're going to build and use and grow infrastructure is quite dynamic. The mere fact that we had a bit of a discussion around terminology at the start reflects the fact that we are all learning as we go on this journey. And therefore, one of the things that we often reflect with businesses on is, what is your level of experience? Because we now use a language when we talk to our customers whereby we describe them as Fred the Fleet and Eddie Electrification. Fred the Fleet is the fleet manager who's been running a fleet his entire life. The kind of things he's likely to say are things like, I run 500 vehicles and have done since I was a man and a boy. I used to fix the wing mirrors. That's the kind of language you're going to get. When you meet Eddie Electrification is often a digital native. They're very curious. They learn. They're constantly learning, and they're trying to keep up with this changing landscape and the dynamic we're creating. And Eddie Electrification is that exemplification of the kind of behaviours and characteristics that we're seeing as fleets consider the transition. And the most interesting ones to watch are either the ones who went fast and have started to fail quickly and are learning and adapting, or those who are perhaps early on in the journey who have taken the time to learn from others. The ones that I worry about are the ones who've done absolutely nothing. Because if they've done nothing, they're often in a point of really learning quite academically. And so much of this is learnt through putting cones in a car park and driving around corners, or taking real customers to the site and seeing what they do. And if you look at the landscape we live in now for infrastructure, it's very much driven by what we've learnt. So we're going to have to learn a lot more until we optimise what a future charging hub looks like, how people arrive and behave. And a lot of our conversations with both our charge point operator partners and our fleet partners are reflecting on their stage of development and maturity on that journey.
So James, that obviously probably brings up a whole range of memories for you of taking people through the curves of considering, adopting, deploying, regretting, reworking.
Yes.
What insights can you give us from your experience?
So I think we've made a bit of an assumption here from the start. We're looking at a journey to full electrification for a fleet. Yes, it does seem to be more heading that way as an end game, but there is obviously going to be a lengthy transition for certain vehicle types. There are some vehicle types where we know, and some operations where we know you could pretty much head to a replacement cycle, go through your 6 years or 5 years and go full electric on that process. There's things like bin trucks now, there's good products out there. You could arguably program your fleet transition with mostly existing products and hope by the end of it a good enough product exists to do the more difficult routes that are left over, and that will be the trajectory in that. But then weekly we have other fleets where there's a lot more logistical high level of energy consumption spread over long areas. There's tramping fleets, there's vehicles going up and down the country from step to step, point to point, and not necessarily going back to a depot. So there's a lot of people who will not be there in that assumption that it's going to be a fully electric future. However, for those where there can be a reasonable trajectory plotted, it is important to think about what the end game looks like. Because if you've got a depot-based fleet, and I'm sorry to come back to depots, it's my home territory really, but if you've got a depot-based fleet, then that fleet has potential to be fully electric and charged largely at the depot. You really need to be thinking about what does this look like as a fully electric fleet? What's the load going to be like? How much energy are you going to need? So not just a case of getting a load of great big chargers and putting them in there, but it's a case of understanding actually some of the vehicles can charge slower. We talked about vans, maybe 7 kilowatt will be adequate for their vans. It may be AC, maybe you need DC charging if you're double shifting. But there's a really important job to do in terms of modelling what your grid connection needs to look like, and really planning for that at the earliest possible stage rather than upgrading it a little bit, going back and doing a bit more. So I think we've really got to sort of view our fleet with what we think it's going to look like in the future and take a pragmatic view. Is this going to be fully electric? Are the products, I think we've got evidence that the products will evolve so that most depot-based fleets will be able to be largely electric. Obviously the problems outside the depots are the subject for the hubs. But yeah, it also, if you are going to be charging some of the vehicles off-site, away from the depot, you don't need to factor in all that energy as well into your maths and your understanding. So it's taking a broad view of what the destination for the fleet looks like and planning so that you're not, yes, you might do it modular, like you say, Katja, but making sure that modular doesn't mean digging things up again and again, but it's all pre-prepared and you're all ready for that long-term future. And of course, you can only predict that to a point. You would hope to plan in a bit of business growth. You'd hope to plan in, if you're a local authority, there will be more houses being built. gets a bit complicated when we look at county boundaries and district boundaries being changed as much as the talk at the moment. But yeah, really need to sort of take a long-term view and not do it piecemeal.
Yeah. So I mean, let me dig into that a little bit more, if I may, because there's a number of fleet organisations and deployments within the context of a local authority's own vehicle needs and their operational requirements. You've talked about bin lorries, right? They contract bus services, right? They've got a road and transport team. They've got maintenance engineers that go out to their housing stock. What's their motivation, or even what's the driver for them to look at those things collectively and go, where do I put the power for my depot, or do I create a hub such that it's the most efficient use of investment, and I'm leading as the local council to take people on this journey? How does that play out?
Yeah, there's lots of layers and lots of levels here. So not every local authority will have every attribute of fleet. You have this mix of obviously unitary authorities having a lot more fleet a lot more needs of fleet than authorities that are lower down the hierarchy. So some will just have a bin truck fleet as their main HGV fleet. Others will have a highways fleet. You may find some have outsourced elements of their fleet as well. So the typical local authority is quite hard to quantify, because some will have a housing maintenance fleet, some will have completely taken that out into a separate housing association business. So lots of the time there won't just be one depot or one location. There may be one big power energy using depot for maybe 4 bin trucks. There may be other services mixed in there, but it may be that there is a housing depot as well, and there could be lots of vehicles taken home. So there is a real need for bespoke thought to go into each local authority, and that is complicated by the prospect of things being reorganised. But that's not to say ignore the issue, because actually there's a lot to be gained. Most local authorities will have a net zero target date, maybe 2030, possibly 2035 or later, depending on who they are. I have seen some for 2025 a couple of years ago, and I think they've gone quiet on that one. But there is pressure from that point of view if you've made a pledge to do that. But of course, we all know that there are now significant rewards for electrifying fleet. Yes, there is extra capital expenditure, and that makes it difficult to work out how you're funding it, potentially. There are different ways to do that, and I'm sure that's another conversation. So if you can get the electric fleet in, you will save on fuel, you will certainly save on energy costs, and obviously the emissions reductions are not only relevant from a carbon climate point of view, the air quality. If you're working around an electric bin lorry, you're not having to breathe in diesel fumes, which may be exacerbated by the fact that the vehicles stop-start and never getting the exhaust emission treatment up to temperature. So actually health and safety, less vibration, more pleasant working environment. So really massive potential gains in there as well.
Yeah. So that's interesting, and the link thought for you, Cassia, is actually the environment, the more pleasant environment. And so when we think about the hub context for multiple fleet users, what are you doing to make that more than just a charging destination?
So I mean, obviously we have an opportunity here. While building infrastructure from scratch, again, coming back, Neil, thank you very much for this, cleaning the whiteboard and let's draw this out as though we have complete carte blanche. And one of the key things I think we can do here is actually think about what do driver facilities need to look like. If we're going to make sure that people can properly rest. I'm thinking particularly on the HGV side now, though it does apply to van drivers as well. But we know the sort of state of truck stop facilities in particular in the UK is dire. And a lot of the good facilities see sort of 90+% capacity every night. If not, they're completely full and sort of turning trucks away. So I think there's a yeah, a pretty cool, a pretty neat opportunity to actually build stuff that is fun, that is appealing, that is calming, depending on kind of which sort of architectural flavour you want to lean into. And we're going to be sharing some of our designs for our driver facilities very soon, which I'm very, very excited about. Yep. It's drawn inspiration from the Humber Bridge up in northeast Lincolnshire, which is where one of our first sites is going to be. And we're just trying to think a little bit differently about what these spaces can be. Also recognising that the drivers in the world are still like Uncle George's, who I've sort of introduced to this audience before, which is my actual Uncle George who drives trucks up in Shropshire. If I present some of the places that I like to hang out, he would be like, please God, no, don't take me there. So I have to temper my sort of creative flair and designs. But I don't think that it's sort of possible to argue that the standards need to be raised, and the opportunity while we're building a load more infrastructure anyway is the right one to take to actually sort of invest properly in new facilities.
Yeah, I raise it because it's such an important point. I mean, I'm inspired today by looking at some stuff in the office where we were sat before. 1 in 5 accidents relates to tiredness of a driver. All right, and so when we think about that and we think about the places we want to create, not only serve the business operational purpose of refueling the vehicle, but actually creating a safe environment for driver to rest and be ready for the next stage of their duty, then these things are so critical.
Yeah,
right?
totally. And that point around sort of tiredness, and we've seen all sorts of statistics about the rates of diabetes amongst HGV drivers, the rates of depression amongst HGV drivers being in both cases so much greater elevated than the sort of average population. There are some of those things that we can obviously try and contribute towards. There are some that will remain forever challenging. It was only sort of explained to me at a recent driver forum that we hosted that, yeah, the reason that we're also prone to sort of diabetes, we don't hydrate because it's really annoying to need to go to the bathroom when you have to do a very long stint on the road. And that's, we were saying, oh, but there's a water fountains in at these sites. That will really help. And people are like, there's a sort of very physical thing that we can't get around here, which is just kind of annoying to have to do that.
Yes. So one of our mutual friends, Graham Cooper, I think is on a podcast somewhere, as having said, my car has more ability to do range than my body does.
Yeah.
Right, so he called it bladder anxiety rather than range anxiety, and I think that was also played back to Farage on an interview by Sam Clark, if I remember rightly. But it is a really important point, and I think let's play on that, Neil, and develop that thought as someone providing a charge card service, however you describe it in full. What are you thinking about as driver benefit when you're talking to your clients about the other benefits that they get commercially?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of like GCSE science type territory, isn't it? Because we've got a biology lesson here and we've got a physics lesson as well. I mean, the biology says that the human needs to stop from time to time. What's interesting when you talk to car and van drivers is car and van drivers really don't want to stop. They're going from A to B, they're really busy, they've got something to do. And to be quite frank, when you get in your car, your objective is to go from A to B. It's not to have an amazing charging experience. You want to go from A to B. It's great if you do have a good charging experience because you don't want a negative one because you remember the negative one. So you've got this whole experience of the driver going A to B. As soon as you hit commercial vehicles, the reason the person is in the vehicle is very different. They're there to do a job. They're delivering something. They're going to the next job. They're going to fix a boiler, deliver a parcel, take some goods down the road. And therefore, physics kicks in alongside biology. And the physics that we deal with in this new world of electrification is all about how much energy can we transfer from somewhere into the vehicle. And the reality is petrol and diesel is amazing for that. The energy density of petrol and diesel, the speed to deliver it is very, very short. And therefore, when you go and refuel a commercial vehicle with a liquid fuel, boom, loads of energy drops into the vehicle very quickly, and therefore time is not really a consideration. As soon as you introduce the world of electric, and we're talking about higher and higher powers of chargers, but even when you get to megawatt charging and you've got an EHGV in front of you, you've got to put a lot of juice into that thing. So time becomes really relevant, and therefore there's an operational impact. How does that change the behaviors of the fleet, change the behaviors of the drivers? But there's also the physics element of, well, you've now got 45 minutes, an hour, and particularly for truck drivers where there's a mandatory requirement to stop and do something. You put it together and you can create, this blank sheet of canvas is a fabulous opportunity. You can create an experience that is better. I remember one of the politicians a number of years ago saying that, our objective would be that we should make electric vehicle charging as good as going to the petrol station. And the first thought that went through my head is, well, I've never visited a petrol station for a good experience. I've done it because I have to. What about the idea that we can maybe make electric vehicle charging better than going to a petrol station? And that's where it's really cool to think through, you're going to stop. You can create an environment, like you say, you can create a really high energy environment, you can create a relaxed environment. The ability to do that, create a blank canvas and give people a very different experience, and then perhaps go a step further and go, well, what else could we give them at that time, at that location, that they might have not been able to benefit from in a petrol station? So a lot of our charge point operators speak to us about utilization. Utilization is key in this world. It's revenue and it drives the return on investment. So what can we give drivers to make them stay a bit longer, have a better experience? And one of the really dull things that keeps coming up beyond coffee and toilets tends to be Wi-Fi. Drivers quite often spend time sat with the vehicle. They're going to check their emails. They're going to watch a Netflix series, whatever it might be. But if you give them high quality Wi-Fi and, good coffee and a toilet, you're suddenly lifting the bar above most petrol stations in the UK. So, there's an opportunity here to create an environment which is better for the driver, better for the business, and ultimately, benefits our experience as a whole driving vehicles.
Yeah. And so the question that comes on from that for me is that's no less relevant at a depot than it is at a hub. My suggestion. I'd welcome the thoughts on that, right? Because the government put, I think, 2 rounds of money into improving existing driver facilities for truck stops around the UK, right? And when we looked at the ZHID project, there was an expectation that anything we put into a depot would have amenities that were suitable for any driver to use. So you could never take a driver somewhere where they weren't able to get the rest break, use the bathroom, right? Whatever those things are. So just interested to understand that.
But it feels like there's 2 questions hidden in there. One is about the relationship between the employer and the employee. Anyone who's worked in a large corporation will know that 15 years ago offices were horrible places and they've got better and better, trendier and trendier, and we've all gone to free working spaces and fresh fruit and all those lovely things that come with working for a large corporate. So we've seen employers make an effort with employees, and that should be no different in any sector which has people in vehicles every day or people behind desks every day. Yeah. We are trying to do the right thing by our employees. But there's a secondary question in there, and that secondary question leads to an area which I think is really interesting, which is sharing. As soon as you go into the world of sharing, the initial logic behind sharing electric vehicle charging infrastructure is if someone else has built it and they've got it available, then I can go and use it, and we'll try and keep costs down, and we'll spread the investment, and we'll make this ecosystem a little bit easier to operate in. Mm-hmm. But it leads to that question, which is, when I come to your depot, can I use the toilet? Do you have a canteen I can borrow? Can I log onto the Wi-Fi? Mm-hmm. Actually, I need to stretch my legs. Do you mind if I just, and that's where some of the tension exists with sharing depots, is there is a certain level of expectation around a set of behaviours for your employees on your site. If you have visitors, can it be suitably and safely enforced? And we've spent a huge amount of time talking to bus operators, fleet operators, depot owners around this experience of, we want to share the charging infrastructure because that's what we provide as a service, as charging and payments. But what about the toilet? What about other facilities? What about site rules? Yeah. And that's where complexity can start to kick in.
Very much. And I think the interesting thing is, and you've already said it, is that stuff's there for the employee. It's about how you transfer that and get tacit acceptance of that from a guest charger. Yeah, absolutely.
And not always tacit. Sometimes you need a legal obligation to carry certain, the one we get asked about most frequently is insurance.
Right.
Is the fleet or business that's coming to visit my site suitably insured that if they do run into one of my very expensive electric buses, I can, claim on that insurance? Because if not, I'd rather they didn't visit. Yeah. And then follows the more tacit high-vis jackets, remaining with the vehicle, being polite, following instructions, etc.
Yeah. James, come in.
I think there's a key point here, though, because obviously if you are bringing your truck into a bus depot, let's say, and you are trying to make good use of time, then you can't expect to classify that time as rest if that driver is unable to rest. So if you're saying you've got to stay with your vehicle, you've got to do this, you can't do that, then actually you can't put your tachograph to rest. It almost has to be other duties, and that other duty is supervising, overseeing the vehicle that's charging. So therein lies a key point. If you want the benefit of charging and not, time being money, not whittling that time away, that is a non-negotiable. If you are not going to make the people stay with their vehicle and not provide that facility, then you need to realise that the customers are going to come in knowing that they are not able to classify that as rest time. And I'll tell you, the drivers will be quite keen to labour the point that wasn't a rest. I was in charge of my vehicle. I want a proper break now, and that's really key from the customer point of view. But it's also really key in terms of actually developing that market, because if you don't provide that facility, then the market is only going to go so far with people who are having to pay for their driver to essentially have two breaks, just so one for charging and one for sitting. And we do see this debate go across, even in the van sector. You know, there's an argument as to, am I on my break when my van's charging? And I think if the definition of facilities that are suitable for rest are probably key there.
Yeah, we this is one of the things we picked up as we've gone on this journey. Is we started out with a car and van ethos. It's where we began. It's where the vehicles were, and therefore for a van, turn up, 20-minute charge, back on the road, not a problem. As soon as you introduce trucks, then a layer of different experiences are required, and that's exactly where we're having to take, you know, the product. Going back to this idea of transition, you know, we built something that works for cars and vans. Now we're having to learn, do it again, see what else needs to be delivered. And that's where, you know, this dynamic changing nature of the market makes it so much fun.
Yeah, it's good.
So the thought that takes me on to is there are a number of things that could disrupt a driver from getting a good break.
Yeah.
And one of those could well be the process of instigating a charge. How do I pay for the charge? How do I receipt the fact that I've had a charge? So Cassio, in that sort of with that challenge, how did Aegis go about making that as simple, as efficient, as reliable, so that the driver can go off and genuinely have a good break?
Yeah, and there's loads of ideas that we've had around this, and every time we're sort of workshopping it, we're always trying to think about these sort of principles of reliability and sort of flexibility and minimising downtime. Obviously, I'd caveat by saying Aegis Energy hasn't built anything yet, and there's going to be a huge period of just testing and trialling and probably getting it completely wrong and having to train and retrain and sort of restructure. And I don't think anybody should shy away from that fact who's kind of trying to operate in this market.
Test, learn, evolve. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, and be kind of humble, I think, to all of those things sort of kicking off at the same time. That said, the ways that we are preparing to sort of deliver as seamless as a sort of proposition as possible is getting as many of our kind of customers sort of signed up as pre-committed or pre-booked customers as possible, meaning that we have all of their license plates sort of on a database, stored, ready to go, so that when they turn up for a pre-booked slot, which would be the ideal way that we obviously sort of distribute charging, it's ANPR on entry, it's minimal time at the kiosk just to confirm that they're happy with sort of T's and C's. In they go, allocated to bay 3. Driver can, you know, without disruption to that flow, park up, plug in, and, you know, importantly, switch the tachograph so he or she can begin their break. Yep. That's how we're kind of modelling it for day one. In future states where sort of technology constraints don't exist, there's all sorts of other funky ways that we want to take the pre-booking system, for example, to be able to integrate it with the sort of telematics or GPS coordinates of the vehicle so that you can constantly anticipate how far away that vehicle is from site and therefore update the sort of booked slot, booked bay in live time. At the moment, we're just fudging that by basically giving 2.5 hours for every charging slot and saying, you know, hopefully that accommodates any traffic or disruption, and if not, you need to give us a ring. But yeah, I think that that's the kind of principal ways, and then payment comes into it in quite a big way. So trying to accommodate multiple payment methods, trying to minimise the number of ways that a driver can pay at different locations. I know that's a massive challenge that we've got to solve as an industry. I know that's one that Power's sort of squarely focused on solving. Yeah,
I mean, I think back and when I emptied out my first EV to move into my second EV, what I took out the central console was a wodge of cards, right? The Shell card and this, that, a BP, a Pulse card, and
Source card,
all-
a pod point card.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? And I smile now, right? Because I think about it and think, the fact I used to have that isn't a paradigm we can move into commercial fleet operations. We can't expect them to have that, all right? So Neil, talk to us about, what's the proposition look like? What are clients asking for to make that experience seamless, painless, almost thoughtless for their drivers?
Yeah, and then I think there's multiple experiences in here we need to break down, but the one that probably we should touch on first is actually that process of arriving at a charger and getting electricity out of it. And I spend quite a lot of time talking to people who have no experience with electric vehicles, and I often start by saying, listen, this is a physically big piece of kit with a physically heavy cable on it. And one of the first things people have to do is wrestle the cable into the vehicle. And sometimes that genuinely does mean wrestle. These are heavy cables. But if you start with that journey, the first thing that we've noticed huge variance on is some operators who like you to authenticate first and then plug in, and others who want you to plug in and authenticate afterwards. And dare I say it, the market's probably about a 50-50 split at the moment. But that journey of I arrive at a charger, and because we know there's a variance, there's often a handful of instructions. If there's too many instructions, we have a basic thesis in life, which is humans don't read anything. People don't read it. So give them 2 or 3 instructions, or the other one I like is the screen that flashes at you and tells you to plug in first or authenticate first. So you've got to get through that journey. And you talked about cards and pulling a wad of cards out of your car. And we started the business with no cards. And quite early on, we had someone say, would it be possible to get a card? So we started issuing cards, and 96% of our transactions are on cards. Now, fundamentally, you go, well, it's an older, less sophisticated technology. Why is that? And it comes down to some very basic human factors. Us soft, squidgy humans behave in unusual ways. If you're standing in the rain and you pull up at a charging location, you have to open the app, and you have to remember which app it is, and it's raining on your phone, so it's not pressing the right button and everything. You then got to find the charger. You've then got to find the connector that you need to actually initiate. And if you turn up at one of your hubs, that will be a nightmare, because you're going to have 25, 30, 50 connectors in your list, and you're going to scroll through this list. And one of the things that our industry is very, very poor at is what we describe as physical labeling. So we get sent a long string awkward code which ends 1234A. You then turn up at the site and you go, there's a 34A and a 34B, but there's also a 3 and a 4, and they've got an A and a B, and there's a 1, 2, 3 over there. And that journey is just horrible.
In my head, I'm at the Birmingham NEC site.
Yeah, it's a great example. The other one that's great is Braintree. It's a big site with a lot of chargers and different players on the same site. What do you do? So the card becomes your default. You pull it out, you tap it on the machine, and you're physically there, and hey presto, you get a little green light, and you either plug in or you have plugged in, you're charging, and you walk away. And that experience of pulling up, tapping, plugging in, walking away should be seconds. Right. I remember early on, my journey was always like, you stood at the charger and you waited for 0.1 kilowatt hours to go through, because then you knew it was actually working, and you had the highest probability you were actually going to get a charge, and then you left your vehicle. I'm hoping that we're going to overcome this whole journey with another piece of technology, which is I've famously called 15 lemonades, but it is 15118, 15118, which is an international standard for plug and charge. Now, plug and charge requires the automotive manufacturer and the charge point operator to roll out a token on the vehicle. Someone like ourselves would then issue the token and handle all the payments, but it needs to be on both the vehicle and the charger to enable that to happen. And we see that in cars. The Germans, particularly BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, are all pushing that standard. We're not seeing such a high uptake in the world of trucks, and therefore what we're starting to see in trucks is the use of an older standard, which is a DIN spec, and I can't remember the number, it's 70121 or something like that. It's a German, it's a German standard.
So disappointed. It was going so well. How did we get this far?
There is a German standard, a very good German standard, which enables the MAC address to be saved, and effectively you get what is a recording of that vehicle, and you can preload that MAC address, and that again enables that plug and charge experience. But when you look at commercial vehicles, that is the experience they need to have. Ultimately, they need to be able to. They don't really care about all our technology and wizardry. They want to go in, plug in, get the vehicle charging, and go and do whatever else it is they want to do. Yeah. So that experience around payment and getting energy out of a unit is experience one. The second one, which I think is really interesting, is booking. And I have booking written on my page because I was talking to someone about this the other day. Booking for me is not required. And that upsets a lot of people when I say that. And it upsets a lot of people for a couple of different reasons. Booking in cars and vans, maybe less so vans, but definitely in cars, exists. 20% of charge point operators enable some form of booking system. 0.2% of all sessions are booked. Car drivers don't do booking. It's not something they're into. It might come in the future, and particularly if you're doing an overnight at a hotel or you're going on a ferry or something very time-bound, very specific, you might use it. But for general A to B route finding, people don't book. Commercial vehicles will need it. But I'm of the opinion at the moment that, you described, if they're running late at the moment, you call them up. I think that's where we are on the journey, is we don't have a standard approach to booking. It's one of the things we're going to have to address over the next 12, 18 months. And I'm hopeful we'll see some really positive steps forward on booking. But right this moment, it doesn't really exist. It's got to go further. So when our customers come to us and ask us for things, booking is often high on the agenda. When you get under the skin and explore what they really need and when they want it, they kind of almost want the confidence it's coming, but don't need it right now. So booking's the one which gets asked about a lot, but isn't delivered. 1511.8 or plug-in charge is something everyone wants to get to as a dream, but there's too many parties involved to enable us to get there quite yet. So booking first, plug-in charge second.
Okay, so 15 lemonades, right?
15
15 lemonades. That's what we need to remember. I like
15
that.
lemonades.
James, are you feeling this from your engagements about people going, this isn't going to work without booking, and then you peel the onion and they realise there's a few other things they need to think about first?
So I think from my seat in the depot, not necessarily so much the hub, but dealing with a lot of people with fleets that return, a lot of fleets that are based in that way, then yeah, that's not necessarily the thought process. If you know that you're going to be out somewhere, and if you know that you're going to be, let's say, making a delivery somewhere, then there's a level at which I think I'm talking from an early point of transition, not necessarily got to the electric vehicles yet, planning ahead, is thinking actually not everybody wants to charge at a public hub location because there's costs that go with that, there's uncertainties to do with booking that go with that. And I'm sure there's definitely going to be a place for it, and it's definitely going to be probably in some of those more difficult to electrify vehicles, it's going to be absolutely essential. But thinking to another side is actually there's another form of planning as well. So let's say you own a series of shops and you do deliveries. Is there a way that you can put rapid charging at the delivery points for the vehicles, so that can be planned in with your booking of your deliveries, and then you could perhaps outsource that to other suppliers that may be delivering as well. Another example was I did some work with a potato factory, and they did a lot of delivery into a big supermarket distribution hub, and sometimes the truck could be waiting an hour, 2 hours to get their slot to unload the potatoes at the factory. Now, wouldn't that just be an incredible use of time if that 2 hour slot, or even if it's an hour slot, could be used to top up that vehicle? It could certainly help go some way to do that. So yeah, the questions I'm hearing are probably more around how we can make it work with the vehicles that we can see are nearly able to transition. The longer, the bigger fruit, the 23-hour operating vehicles that need this kind of hub-based charging. I think a lot of people are feeling that they want the reassurance of being able to book while the resource is so limited. And I think that's the key thing.
Yeah.
In the early stages, people are going to want the certainty that they're not going to be wasting time to get on a charging bay. So therefore booking at that point is probably going to be a lot more of a safety blanket. If the rollout of chargers can happen quicker than the take-up of vehicles in terms of availability, then we have a different equation.
Yes.
And we don't need the booking. And I think this is the evidence that Neil has pointed out is that with cars, people are generally confident they can get charged somewhere. So therefore, only 0.2% of people are so worried that they actually bother to book. And I think that's going to be, it's very hard at this point to sort of call how it will go, but with the right investment, the right facilities pitched at the right level as the electric vehicle take-up grows, then yeah, this could be managed in a way that booking is less important than it feels at the moment.
That's fascinating. I'll come to you, Cassie, right? Because you and I both wrote notes at the same time. In my perception of what I hear from clients, whether it's their own facilities where they will open it up to others, or whether they're looking at using others' facilities, whether it's hub or another person's depot, that concept of I need nothing to disrupt the productivity of this vehicle always leads them to booking a slot is the answer. And even if they're the fleet manager and they're not thinking about booking their vehicles elsewhere, they're still thinking about scheduling their vehicles on their own assets. It's a booking system, right? Because it's about scheduling. You might have assets that mean all the trucks are plugged in if you're lucky, but a lot of the time they're going to be moving vehicles onto and off of limited charging assets in the short term, I guess. Cassie, what does this bring up in your mind as you're listening to what James is saying?
Yeah, I've had like a million thoughts in the last couple of minutes, so I'm going to try and synthesize and prioritise. I think that the car, so I guess there's been a lot of comparisons to car because we have a car charging market, and so it's easy to sort of get tempted down the path of making comparisons. But I just think it's the totally wrong comparison to be making and to be drawing. And I would like to challenge the kind of assertion that there's going to be a minimal or a sort of fractious role for public charging in the picture, just because of how much power and electricity is required in the truck market. And I think that whereas maybe you can get by with lower speed chargers and longer sessions in the car and van market, with trucks, even a relatively modest fleet, let's say 25 trucks, if they're looking to get their slow overnight trickle charging done in a kind of relatively constrained window of, say, 8 hours overnight, we're still talking about millions of pounds worth of capex at the depot to be able to get that kind of throughput and that kind of infrastructure implemented. And so there has to be another scalable option that is available to kind of get the transition going. And I think that's the role that public or hub or shared infrastructure plays, is actually to catalyse more vehicles coming on the road quicker in a scalable way, because otherwise we're just never going to get to a place where fleets can chuck 5 million quid, 10 million quid at the problem on day one to electrify, a modest number of trucks.
This goes back to this idea of a transition. Today, if you're thinking about buying an electric truck, one of the first things you might want to think about is where's the infrastructure. You haven't built any yourself, and therefore you're considering it. But if someone, your fleet sales consultant can show you a map with some pins on it, it gives you a level of confidence. You buy your first truck, you have your first experience, you then think about the other 24 trucks in your fleet. Now you're thinking about putting 4 or 5 million quid to work to build infrastructure for those sites, and you want to see more pins, you want to have more certainty. And I think the level of experience and the stage we're at is analogous to the car market in some senses, but is also different to the car market in others. And what we're spending a lot of time doing is trying to unpick the similarities and the differences. And it's that journey that we're going on to try and help people go from, yes, I got one truck, I just need to know there's some infrastructure out there. And on that journey, we have to find ways to help people at different stages, because each step of the journey has a different set of problems as you level up your electric fleet status until you become a complete fleet ninja, and then you've got a combination of everything. But the reality is, at the beginning, people are very much looking for just some level of confidence that there's pins on a map, and then they'll go, oh, I need booking, and then they'll go, oh, I need depot charge, and then I'll need 10 other things as they go on that journey, but different people are at different stages. Ultimately, I'm really fascinated by what you alluded to there about people putting a lot of capital to work in their own business versus buying in public or hub or commercial vehicle locations. I've spent a lot of time trying to talk about this idea of total cost of charging. We talk about total cost of ownership a lot for vehicles, and everyone's kind of got that as a fleet manager. You bundle everything together, you divide it through by miles, or whatever your metric is, and you come out with the total cost of ownership. Total cost of charging is the same concept. people often talk about being able to charge for 20p inside the depot or 25p inside the depot, but they're looking at the marginal cost of the electricity.
Yes.
They forget that infrastructure spend that goes in up front. They forget the operations of that site, the maintenance of that site, the insurance of that site, and they just disregard all those costs, put them in a big pile and go, that's not my worry. I'm only looking at the marginal costs. And they compare a public charging location, and I'll pick on some of the higher price, car and van CPOs who are running at 85p and go, I can charge at home for 5p. And that delta is hard in the car and van market, but when you enter commercial, you've got to put much bigger capex in, grid connections, digging up ground, planning permission, all of that stuff. It's a different kettle of fish, and therefore total cost of charging really has to be considered.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think one of the things for me is price, reliability, and availability are the things that people talk about wanting control over. And I think traditionally that was about inside my fence. I have those things. I think what we're seeing now evolve, and the propositions that you talk of and others talk of, provide a lot of that in a shared environment. And I think there's an education piece, and obviously things like this hopefully go some way to doing that. How would you pick up on that in terms of Neil's, the thing about the marginal cost is almost a ridiculous singular consideration when there's so much potential infrastructure cost?
I think it's a really, really helpful sort of framework or language to use as the total cost of charging. And we've been doing a lot of exercise, a lot of modelling, a lot of work to sort of articulate exactly that point. And I think that essentially what's going on here is, if we are going to draw sort of the similarities and the differences with the car market, in the car market, the car owner essentially sees their home charging as an infinite time horizon opportunity, right? And that's the key thing that this is all sensitive to, is what is the time horizon that we're talking about? And if the time horizon is infinite, then absolutely you should totally invest in building out as much of this as you can at your depot or at your home, on your side of the fence, to use your language. But as soon as that time horizon shrinks, and we're talking about still relatively large amounts of time, 5 years, 10 years, that becomes a capital project that is difficult to justify and essentially put a load of millions of pounds of infrastructure on your own yard. And I think that a lot of people talk about this as being a very interesting opportunity to own your energy costs for the first time. And so I absolutely buy into that if these are family-run businesses who plan to exist for multiple generations to come, or if it's even if it's just a company who sort of owns their own land and owns their own depots and owns their own warehouses, then depot charging is the right thing to invest in, because you can obviously amortize or depreciate that upfront cost over a longer time. But a lot of the industry is not there, and a lot of industry doesn't think along those sort of time horizons. Certainly like 3PLs who are working on contracts that can sometimes only be sort of 2 + 2 years. And for those, I think they need to sort of look outside of the depot options, and they need to just think about locking in a reasonable OPEX. And the key word is reasonable there. There is a role for public charging providers to play here in making the cost reasonable. But then to me, that is the more kind of the more optimal model is don't pay the CapEx, pay something reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people obviously don't own their depot, they don't own their location. It's a rent thing, and then it's complicated, and they might only have a tenure that lasts a few years. So, what's the point investing there, because we've got to move at some point, or we may get shifted out against our will. Completely see all that. But I guess the pitfall, the difficulty that we come to is then when people, it's getting that cost right against diesel, isn't it? That's where the competition then comes in a sense. And with the best will in the world, we all want to go zero emission. We want to sort of address the climate emergency. But when the cost differential is such that there's no recovery of those extra capital costs, it is a big question then.
The other thing then that this brings me on to may not seem immediately obvious, but as I listen to you, if I'm developing something in my depot, I've got my vehicles in mind, I've got compatibility in mind. How can I be certain when I go out beyond my fence that when my vehicles get to where they might otherwise charge, I've not got other issues, incompatibility issues? So how does that come into play? How do you approach that? What vehicle might turn up whatever condition the battery might be in, whatever charger connection type it might have. How do you plan to accommodate such a range of things? Because we haven't got standardization of charge point location on the vehicle and such like,
So I think there's a range of ways to answer that question. Some of it is sort of just speaking to the fact that obviously you want to make sure that the charger can talk to the vehicle, and so there are protocols now to make sure that is a sort of common technical language. I forget the name of the principle, whether it's OCPI or otherwise, but making sure that essentially that connection point can happen and there is compatibility there. I think the other way that you can do it, at least to begin with, while we don't have a kind of uniform standard for where the actual sort of connecting point is on the vehicle itself, is you need to have a clever enough system that's running the sites, running these hubs, so that it can allocate to the appropriate bay. So we're installing all of our chargers in between each of the bays, so you constantly have the ability to plug in on either side, depending on where the charger is, or at the front for the OEMs who are sort of taking that path. But you need a clever enough system, coming back to my point around the pre-booking and the kiosk, to be able to say, okay, bay 1 is occupied. They want to take the full whack, 400 kilowatts or 250 kilowatts, whatever the vehicle can accept on day 1. So let's not use bay 2. Let's make sure that charger and the throughput of that charger is preserved, and let's get the vehicle to park up in bay 3.
Yeah, great. And I mean, that's exactly in my head. You've covered the exact scenario that worries me, right? I turn up in a truck that can charge at 250 and I go onto a 400 kilowatt charger. The next person in turns up in a truck that can charge at 400 and only has a 200 kilowatt charger. We're suboptimal, right? So we are frustrating one business in being efficient. We're underutilizing the assets. We are under-delivering on the income potential. There's all those multiplicity of things, which it happens in either place. But I think an operator thinks, I can manage that in my location because I know what my vehicles are capable of. When I go to someone else's, and you've got a massive variation of truck specs and techs and revisions. Yeah, it's a really fascinating piece of getting it right, and that direction of a trucker coming to site is a really good way of looking at it. Great. And the scope of your site gives that flexibility, right? The other thing I wanted to ask about, Cassia, is we talk a lot about trucks in the context of what we do, but you've gone much wider than thinking about a large, vehicle. To go back to Neil's small, medium, large. Can we just talk around that sort of design philosophy for a range of vehicles?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's been good today to have so much time spent, I think, also on the van market as well as the truck market. Obviously, the needs of those segments are really, really different, and actually, I think coming back to Neil's comment right at the beginning of the conversation around actually these are not sort of fleets, these are businesses that have vehicles, because I think in the van market in particular, that's really prevalent, and it's a lot more about how you enable these businesses to just continue to do what they most want to do, whether that's install fibre optic cables around the country, or whether it's delivering parcels. So for that segment, we've tried to be sort of creative around the ways that the site can be used. There's some principles that will be common to both, which is like high security standards, barriers on entry and exit, so we have that sense of control, pre-booking, for example. But I think that there's typically what we're finding is that in the van market, we get approached by fleets in either one of two scenarios. Either we're right next door, and so they want to just avoid the depot infrastructure costs because they're like, yeah, great, this is just as easy as doing it ourselves. Or they are facing the problem that a lot of van fleets have, which is that 40 or 50% of their driver cohort doesn't have access to a home parking space. Right. And therefore, there is no option for kind of installing, slow AC charging at home. They just don't have a driveway. And so then we kind of get approached in a more sort of structural way to say, okay, how can we think about putting through a lot of vans in a sort of quite a systematic way through to your site, because your site actually has capacity to take them rather than needing to constantly reroute them to Ionity and, as we say, pay 80 pence for the privilege of doing that. And so, I think those are the two kind of use cases. There's, as I said, the novel stuff that we're trying to think around is, because we have these driver facilities anyway, is there a way that we can reconfigure what the van driver's day looks like so that they do perhaps take the van back to wherever they dwell or whether they live. They come in for the morning top-up charge. They plug in, they go do their scrum meeting with their transport manager, they get assigned all of their tasks for the day, they have a coffee as they're doing it, 45 minutes is passing, right, I've got my schedule, hop in my van, it's charged, and off I go. It's a different schedule, it's a different operating model to the one that exists today, so it takes a bit more work and it takes a bit more sort of replanning. But, you know, again, coming back to the point around, maybe that's actually a more, not more fun, but a better experience for that driver, because actually they get to sort of kill a couple of birds in one stone, get a coffee as they're doing it, etc. But yeah, it takes a bit more kind of creativity and a bit more work with the fleet.
James, do you find you're at a point where they are willing to consider operational flexibility to accommodate some of the cost-saving potential of not having to have more infrastructure than is necessary if they flex operation?
Okay. So, Cassia, just to sort of take it back a step, Cassia talked about the 40% or 50% who haven't got a drive. Well, I've done some work with some fleets that are based from home, and that 40% figure is technically correct. But the reality is when you start to talk to drivers and talk to people, that figure is more like 80% that will not. And that's not because they haven't got drives, it's because they park their car on the drive, or their partner's car is parked on the drive. Their drive isn't suitable for a van. There's lots of reasons that there's no way of getting power to their drive, perhaps. So there are a lot of reasons why that figure is probably more like 75 or 80% people who couldn't charge at home.
I mean, James, I hear that some councils don't like people putting commercial vans in residential areas. Is that a factor?
There are definitely some places where you can buy a house, probably, and there is a covenant that suggests you can't park a caravan or a van on your drive. I would imagine there are a lot of places where people do park vans and where those covenants exist and nobody enforces them.
Okay.
So
Sorry to interrupt.
that's another level at which that works as well. I've not seen that used as an excuse to not take a van and park it and charge it on my drive yet, but it's probably one for people's armoury to get there. So done some work with those fleets. So initially you've got a low-hanging fruit, and a lot of people have sort of gone through that. But once you've gone through that 20%, and of course you've got all the complications of turnover, people moving house, people who rent their house, people who perhaps live at somebody else's house, all of these things that can be typical to different van drivers' lives. You end up with a situation where it's a lot more desirable to find a solution away from people's homes, so that yes, maybe they park on the street, yes, maybe they can park, some of them can park on a drive, but to have a replicable solution across your fleet, then that's desirable. Now, there are different models. If you've got a national model where you can be anywhere, then that's a lot more difficult than if you've got a local organisation. Let's say a housing association works within a borough or a district or a county. They tend to go to places more consistently. So there may be a Screwfix or a place where everybody goes to pick up supplies. Now, wouldn't that be a great place to locate charging, rapid charging, max it out for that 20 minutes? So I did a bit of modelling for a council on that, and there's so many stops at this location, you could actually get about 30% of the fleet's energy in the vehicles in this location if you put it on max power. Now, the other thing you can do if you're a housing association is you may go to do a lot of work in a block of flats. There may be several blocks of flats with car parks that the council own that occupy a lot of van space. So if you can find the top locations, you use your telematics data, you can identify key points. Now, wouldn't it be great if the councils could work with partners to make those hubs? And of course, when it's not the working day, they could be used by residents. There's lots of ways to think out the box that could prevent the need for vehicles being charged on drives, which we know is fundamentally a really tough ask. But yeah, when you start to go on the national fleets and you start to get longer distances, then it does come to more using the hubs if that's the right word. But the places, the McDonald's that sometimes aren't hubs, but using the infrastructure that exists on the map. So yeah, I think I've probably completely missed the original question.
No, you haven't. You haven't. And other fast food restaurants do exist, all right, than just our friend with the golden arches. But I often think about that. I mean, I drive past one in Rutland. We joked about it before we came into the studio about Rutland being the last place in England to have a McDonald's, and it now has 4 Instavolt chargers. I was there on Sunday, passing by, I hasten to add. No one on it. 10 a.m. Sunday morning, no one on. Came back later on from Mum, 4 p.m. No one on them. All right, and so it's interesting because we're deploying a lot, and there's great headlines in the press about how much charging assets are being deployed, and therefore utilisation must be a challenge that could be solved by mixing some of these use cases up. And I think, debate, Neil. That's absolutely.
I mean, what we're dealing with is a supply and demand economy.
Yep.
It's as simple as that. You know, the reality is, in my perspective, and it's somewhat unpopular when I speak to my charge point partners, is we have probably overbuilt car and van charging infrastructure. Right. Standard bay size infrastructure. We've got too much. The reason I'm suggesting that is, having done a lot of modelling in a prior life with a large energy utility, sat looking at this, I was looking at 6 to 8 charging sessions a day. You know, define a charging sessions, 20 odd kilowatt hours. You know, fix a price. You know, you need 6 to 8 a day to break even. On average, from the analysis we've done, we're seeing between 2 and 3 charging sessions a day on rapid chargers in the UK.
Wow.
So we're way off return on investment.
Yeah.
But that's because the charge point operators have done the right thing. They've invested ahead of demand, they've built the infrastructure, they've responded to government signals, driver signals, they've built the infrastructure. So now the problem they're facing is utilisation. And that's where I think some of the conversation you were alluding to around, you know, really working with the customer to understand where they need it and getting some form of commitment towards the volumes needed in the right place, at the right time, you know, at your screw fix or wherever it might be, driving those committed volumes really starts to make sense. I then start to talk about another economic concept to align to supply and demand economics. There's a concept in economics around something called the Laffer curve. And the idea of the Laffer curve is this idea that there's an optimal amount of tax you put into a society. And that optimal amount of tax, you get the right amount of tax collection, but people still work hard to create value for themselves. It's very similar with charge point operators. If you put the price too high, no one goes there because it's too expensive. If you put the price too low, you don't make a return on investment. So it's like a sweet spot in pricing that we've got to optimize for. And that's what I think is really interesting, seeing some of the pricing models coming out of people in the marketplace. Mylant's at 45 pence INCFAT, 39.9 XFAT. People like the team at AW Energy, who now supply direct from the turbine to your chargers, you're pricing on a similar basis. Mm-hmm. You go, right, those are really aggressive cost models. And then you've got the 85Ps. And we've got to go and look at that spectrum of price and compare it to what we used to see. And I think, although it does sound quite big, it's slowly compressing. As we're getting a bit more confidence in utilization, a bit more confidence in usage, a bit more confidence in where your location is. Because some locations, motorways, can carry a premium over other locations, which maybe, you know, you need to push people to come there. So the pricing model, the utilization model is all going to come together as we work on this growth in this transition. Because at the moment, my view is there's probably not enough vehicles on the road to drive the return on investment we need.
So just as a little aside, and I'm sitting here smiling, and I've got to get it out. The Laffer curve is actually mentioned in Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
It is.
When the guy's at the board at the front,
The board at the very beginning.
and he turns around and everybody's either
Anybody?
catatonic, dribbling. It's the Laffer curve. Anybody higher? Anybody higher? It's higher.
Yeah.
Well, I was trying to remember if it's Laffer because it's a smiley face or it's L-A-F-F-E-R.
It's L-A-F-E-R. I think it might be the German economist.
Positive
Indeed.
coincidence that
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
I love that.
Sorry, you were going to make a point.
I was going to make a point, yes. I was going to say that I think that the relationship is very, very dynamic that you just described.
Yeah, hugely.
It's totally because car chargers, I imagine, can't bank on the demand that's coming because utilisation is so low that they have to whack the prices up so high. they have investors as well. They have to generate their IRR, blah, blah, blah.
And then within that, you've got all the microeconomics of what the status of the business is and all those things. So yeah, the pricing is still a bit of a mystery.
But I think that's where, again, we can totally just sort of ditch that model in the commercial vehicle market, where we have greater predictability, where we have greater sort of line of sight to which routes are going to be there every day. Charging sessions are predictable. Let's book them in. Let's quantify that volume. Let's lock it in and contract it. And then, the likes of Aegis Energy's investors can say, okay, there's pre-contracted demand. We don't have to be as aggressive on the pricing because it's not merchant. It is pre-committed.
And it works for commercial vehicles because obviously there's a cost to operate in my fleet. I will then pass that on to my customer to deliver my goods and services. If I get some price certainty, I can then provide that price. So there's a nice lockstep model in there between the people who are going to build the infrastructure and the people who are actually running on the service.
Yeah, and I think that price certainty piece is really interesting. And again, James, really interested. The ways of getting the lowest cost of energy are, not necessarily about going out to the grid, right? A lot of places where at home depot, especially where we're going to put some of these bigger fleets, van or truck, are going to be underneath big sheds with big roofs. So, James, is there anything you want to unearth with that in terms of, are people thinking, hold on a minute here, I can generate energy quite cost effectively, and how do I get that into one of my most expensive assets to run, my vehicle fleet?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of that going on. Obviously, it depends what your shed is used for, because quite a lot of sheds have quite a lot of their own energy demand anyway. There's also a timing factor in there as well. So obviously, if you've got a lot of high intensity energy use, let's say you've got a factory, then naturally you will generate in the day and use that to power machinery. There won't be a lot left over for a returning fleet. However, if you've got a shed that's used for less energy intensive reasons, then yeah, great potential. But you probably will need to store that energy in order to be able to deploy that energy into your fleet. So obviously then there's the cost of batteries. Yeah. So battery costs reducing a lot. That's very, become a lot more favourable. There is an element where batteries may actually be the difference between having enough capacity and generation may actually be the difference between having enough capacity to power your fleet or not as well. So batteries could be used to avoid grid connection costs as well. So the battery isn't necessarily just a cost, it can offset other costs as well. And then obviously there's the whole argument of selling if you've got massive space to generate. I mean, it might not be that you've got some things we've seen, you haven't necessarily got the roof, but you might have a field next door. And that, I've had a couple of clients that have got land adjacent to where the vehicles are stored, where actually if we put solar panels here, then yeah, again, batteries are probably part of the answer for these people. But yeah, definitely a lot of creative thinking to be had. Yeah. Tends to be default thought on solar, but of course we've got increasing possibilities for wind as well these days. Yeah. So I think all of this is brilliant, because actually any of that energy that's used is properly zero emission as well. So we're not talking about any grid factors here. We're talking about completely clean, and I think it's also evident from people who are running hubs as well. Lots of people are if you see GridServe have got solar panels on their roof, they're generating in these locations. So it's an incredibly virtuous and beneficial, because obviously it's low cost energy as well. It's yes, there's return on investment needed, but yeah, what a fantastic concept to use that space and generate energy from the sun or the wind.
What made me think about it was you commented about is it AW Energy at Leighton Buzzard? Yeah. And the fact that they've got that wind turbine there, and I assume a battery to some extent, and then the ChemPower kit that's actually high power chargers for what was intended as a bus charging station. And it links back to something we said earlier. This isn't just about sheds, it's about use of land and what that land represents, because a yard may not have any buildings on it. It may be an open yard where there's equipment stored or materials stored. It doesn't need to be under a roof, but there's facility to either bring power from local or to generate on site, depending on the technologies we use. And they're all going to be dynamics which will influence that lowest cost of energy, levelized cost of energy. Yeah.
And I think there's obviously other options, other ways you can buy your electricity. I'm aware of a site in Cardiff where I think there's also one in Exeter where people buy a private wire, get their electricity from a third party who's paid to develop the solar, and there is a wire that runs between there and the depot, and there's a guaranteed price of electricity, and somebody else has done the investing. Yes, you pay a premium on the per kilowatt rate, but that reflects that investment, and you know that you're getting zero emission electricity off the grid. And then there's obviously virtual power purchase, lots of different complexities that you can make work for yourself. There's also the possibility of using the energy you generate as a commodity in itself. So if you've got energy when you don't need it, selling it back at a higher price, and potentially buying energy cheaper when it's available at a cheaper price. If you've got batteries and there's cheap overnight electricity, then that's another way you can use the batteries.
For shifting.
So I know certainly First Bus have done quite a lot with their business, not just selling to other fleets, not just charging their own fleets up, but finding creative ways to make a business and trade energy. It's a little bit more difficult for public sector to do that, different sets of rules, but credit to companies that have already started on that journey.
Cassia, you had some thoughts there.
Reading my body language perfectly.
That one, your pen. Does anyone notice I'm writing? Yeah.
Perfect, it's working. I just wanted to come back on a couple of the points that you made, just because it's maybe slightly at odds with what we've seen play out essentially, which is, first of all, the idea of sort of solar on the canopies. Again, I think this feels like this works very, very well in a sort of warehouse setting where the sort of surface area is much greater, and so obviously potential to generate is meaningful. I would kind of sort of say from a hub operator's point of view, that is to a certain extent window dressing, and I think that it shouldn't be seen as anything greater than that. The amount of power you can generate from solar on canopies is de minimis relative to how much energy we've got to chuck out of these locations. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. We're going to have solar on our canopies, but I just want to make sure that that's contextualised for people, so that they're not like, oh great, look at this, they're generating all of this power on site. That's fair enough. It's not the reality. And the exercise bikes in the chill-out room. Exactly.
That's where it's really coming from.
Yeah, and
who's riding them?
Well, see, I remember this is GridServe Braintree launch, where they had all the bikes connected in. Connected in, of course they were. Here, come and have a pedal and power some of the cars we're charging. That's what's in my head. Hamster wheels. Yeah. There are a number of businesses looking at this whole element of where are the future high power demands where we can actually avoid congestion on the distribution network by actually providing a private wire from a transmission network connection in order to actually say we remove those barriers, right? And I think in my mind, that slightly different analogy, rather than try and charge up commercial vehicles in a town centre or city centre where there are probably other higher orders of merit for using that power, might be public car charging, it might be other electrification of residential and domestic things. You site those charging locations out so you can take advantage of less congested networks. You're not dwelling a vehicle in an urban environment. You're doing a nice efficient charge, good place, you get into town, you do your duty, you get out of town. That's, I think, an interesting dynamic when we think about, is it a hub? Is it a depot? Is it a destination charge while I'm waiting 2 hours to offload my goods at a retail park? So I think, there's so many ways that we could see very real use cases lending themselves to good opportunities to co-locate a period of downtime with a period of charging so that it's as efficient as possible for the operators to avoid that double impact of charge time, other duties, rest break. we've covered a lot, but I want to ask, are there things you feel we haven't covered? Are there topics that you would like to touch on before we do come to a conclusion?
I'm actually going to reflect a bit on the conversation. We've kind of gone on a journey through, if you were a GCSE student listening to this today, which I'm sure you are, we've kind of gone on a journey through some very basic principles. We covered physics and biology, so we've done a nice science lesson. We've done a bit of economics, how do we actually turn this into a commercial model where we can get a return on investment, people are putting in, cash in the ground to enable this transition. And we talked a little bit about human behavior and psychology. And we kind of, you did it literally right there. You went from, building out the electrical grid, being able to ensure there's right capacity in the right places, which is a challenge, and changing human behavior. I think when you look at all of this and break it down, ultimately you've got a hierarchy it somehow. Human behavior change is really, really hard. But the laws of physics are immutable, so we kind of got to deal with physics first, and then work with the humans as much as possible, and then the economics follows. Economics is a human contract, and unfortunately, the biggest challenge we probably face that we haven't dug into today is briefly mentioned earlier by James, was this idea of cost compatibility with diesel. And with that has to come a secondary consideration, which is a very dull economics topic of pricing externalities. Are we fairly incentivizing this transition? Ultimately, what we're trying to do is reduce impact on air quality, which is a very positive benefit to human life, as you know from people who have died from poor air quality.
Yes.
Alongside reducing climate emissions, which is ultimately the future of our planet. Are we appropriately incentivizing this change? Because at the moment, EV charging is quite expensive, and when you put all the costs together, the cost of the charge, the cost of infrastructure, the transition, all of those things, you can stack it up against diesel, there'll be a whole bunch of people listening right now who go, stick with diesel for a bit longer, I think. And you kind of get it, change is hard. But we need to think also about economics. It's our tool, we control it, we're humans. How do we support these operators as they make the transition and ensure we're incentivizing that change?
Great.
Yeah, I think I would probably add, and it reflects a little bit on what you've said, is the concept of carbon pricing. At the moment, we don't have a carbon tax. Hopefully not giving anybody any ideas by mentioning it here.
I like carbon markets over carbon taxes.
But of course, obviously every tonne of carbon that you emit has a cost to it, whether that's can be quantified in different ways. There's different ways of doing it. There is a COP 20, whatever we were at last, definition and cost, which is a good benchmark for carbon price, and that's gone up quite significantly as the gap between carbon budgets and the temperature change gets closer. So some businesses have used that carbon pricing as a way of factoring into project costs. So if you are able to factor in a carbon price, then that can perhaps help slightly justify a greater cost for a carbon reduction projects like charging infrastructure or electric vehicles, and that can be really helpful just to tip the scales in its favour, because of course lots of companies offset carbon. They spend money outside of their business. Now there's a big whole debate on that and the value of that, which we're not going to get into, but it's not always good. But obviously if you could actually take that money and inset that carbon into investment in your own decarbonisation technologies, then that can add to the power of any case for investing in decarbonisation. And I think, where there's a lot of tons of emissions involved, then that can add up to a reasonable amount of money, which may be the difference between your total cost stacking up and your total cost not stacking up. So adding that into the equation does help. So yeah, that's probably my one add.
Right. Okay. Cassie.
Yeah, I've been sort of trying to think about the main title of the session that we're hosting today, which is where will fleets actually charge? Yep. And I think that the main thing that we often come back to as a company when we're talking about this is actually not to try and get everything like the perfect model that will exist for the next 50 years, because it just doesn't exist. There is so much infrastructure that has to be installed in whichever places we can install it quickly to enable this transition to happen. And by some estimates, we're sort of seeing between 400,000 chargers just for trucks alone by 2050 is probably the number that we need. If you think about fast charging coming in, it might be more like 100,000 to 200,000. So then we're talking about anywhere between 3,000 to 8,000 operational sites that we need to have live over the next 25 years. And given Aegis has come out and said, we're coming to town, guys, don't you worry, we're going to build 50 of those. That's a drop in the ocean of the amount of infrastructure that we need. So I think that the main point I would come back to is like, where are we going to charge? It's like literally anywhere that will let us install things at the right kind of cost and the right kind of buying power on the other side of it. And to leverage a helpful phrase of Jamie Sands's, which is the future going to be kind of neat and organised, or is it going to be shared and messy? I think it's going to be pretty shared and messy for a while yet to come. Yeah. And then we'll kind of reflect after it's happened and say, great, turned out like this.
I think it's fascinating, and we've covered so much ground. Marvellous. Thank you all. I think you're right. Where will fleets actually charge? Right? There's no one answer, right? Fleets are varied in their makeup as an individual operator doing different duties, and in aggregate, massively varied. The timelines for their fleet replacement are another factor we've not even touched on today, and in terms of how quickly that might scale. And also the other things that we hope to hear about, perhaps even as we leave the room, about infrastructure strategy, the 10-year infrastructure plan, and also the incentives, the carrots and the sticks that we might be given in order to motivate us in the right way across the value chain, rather than just beat up vehicle manufacturers under a vecto strategy, which is if you don't sell enough, we're going to come round and charge you a lot in the future. These things all play into the dynamics that will influence who does what. The one thing that sticks in my mind is actually Sean from Wincanton, who was at one of the openings of the Milans Immingham site and said, I've always said I'm going to do it in my own depot, in my own way, behind my fence, because I have control. As I said earlier, price, reliability, availability. And he sat there on a stool at that site and went, and then I see this, and then I hear about the price point, and I have to reflect. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the way the future goes, it can be very different, and I need to think differently. So I think there's a lot of dynamics. We've covered so much of it today, but I think that's a really great place to finish. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.